Welcome to Redbeard Radio. I'm Brian Keith, and today we are talking about sled dog racing, something that all of us have seen on television. None of us have done. None of us, except for Robert Forto, my guest today. He's up there in Willow, Alaska, and he actually does race sled dogs. Robert, welcome to Redbeard Radio.
Thank you very much, Brian, for having me on the show.
Now, I'm thrilled because I myself have never raced sled dogs, but I have a friend somewhere up in Yukon who used to do this, and he's told me stories a long time ago, so I've forgotten the details, which makes all the stories better, right? Of the life of racing his dogs. He talks about, oh yeah, my dogs, this very affectionate, oh yeah, my dogs, and just the way he had this part of his life that is now in the past. But I want to hear from you. Absent the YouTube specials on the Iditarod, what is the life of a sled dog racer actually like?
Well, first off, it's a heck of a lot of work. We have 36 sled dogs here. I've been involved in the sport since 1994 or so. Did it pretty recreationally up until the beginnings of the 2000s. I met my wife to be Michelle. Around that time, we were living in Denver. And one day, Brian, I said, hey, I think I want to chase that crazy Iditarod dream. We moved up to Alaska in 2010. And as they say, the rest is history. I'm still chasing that dream, and a lot has happened in between that time. But it is a lifestyle, not necessarily just something you do for fun. And every day is a new adventure for sure.
Now, I would have assumed before you just told me that you grew up as in a mushing family. Like, oh yeah, my great grandfather won the original Iditarod. Like, I would have assumed that this is a thing that gets passed down in lineage, but you're saying you just went into it cold. Did you already have a bunch of huskies or whatever kind of dogs you use in Denver? Or was it just, you were just called and you had to go do it?
Well, I had my first Siberian in 1987. His name was Axel, of course, after Axl Rose from Guns N' Roses back in the day. And I showed him in competition obedience and, that sort of stuff, sort of regular dog stuff. And then I traveled down to Georgia and met up with a breeder friend of mine, and she had a Siberian Husky kennel. And she said, hey, do you want to go for a ride? And she hooked us up to this cart with 8 or 10 dogs. I don't remember. We took off through the mountains and I was hooked. And I bought 2 dogs at that point, and I had those dogs for years. And then when I moved to Denver, I had, I think about 20 dogs at that point. And that's when we really started kicking it off and becoming quote unquote professional. And when we moved to Alaska, I pretty much started over. We had 1 or 2 dogs at that point. And, 2 became 4, 4 became 6. And as you know, things can add up very quickly if you're passionate about it.
Now, how did you get to that point? And a lot of entrepreneurs hit this point where they're thinking, I think I got to do it, but there's no way how. When you got to that point of decision where you finally, it went from a maybe someday to a yes today now, what was that like? What was that transition like inside yourself?
That's a great question, Brian. It's sort of like starting a startup. You definitely have to have a plan in place. You have to have funding in place. You have to have all of the necessary sort of behind the scenes stuff to get things going. Because if you jump in with 2 feet, and a lot of dog mushers do, they collect dogs from rescues and kind of cast offs and whatnot. And then they end up in a business, and it really is a business where they're unable to succeed because they don't have the tools to make it happen. So buy the best quality dogs you can, learn as much as you can from your mentors, and just think of it as a business and go in with 2 feet and head first, as they say.
Do people think you're crazy?
I've been called crazy from time to time, yes.
I would never have imagined an actual dog sledder to say, well, I really fell in love with dog sledding when I went to Georgia. I've interviewed a lot of interesting people on here, but my brain, like, that just sounds to me like that's unreasonable. And yet here you are, like you're just doing it. So it's just incredible. Now, you also, on your Twitter profile, Robert Forto, you say you're also a beekeeper, which my family's been beekeepers for longer than I've been alive. Is that a side project and you're mostly a musher, or is your beekeeping your main thing and your mushing is sort of a side project, or how does that relate to itself?
Brian, I have more hats than a hat store. I have my hands in just about everything. We do keep bees up here in the summer. We love it. We've been doing it, I think, 6 or 7 years now.
Wow.
And we have such a short season up here that we have to get as much as we possibly can in just a few months, and we love it. I like to say it's truly living on the edge. And if your family's beekeepers, you go out into the yard and you're out there with a million little bugs that could literally kill you at any
Oh yeah.
moment. And I think it's just a cool way to kind of tap into nature and just see
Yeah.
how sort of the process works.
We just got 2 new hives. We lost both our hives last winter. My folks had 4 hives. They lost all 4 hives, which for folks who aren't beekeepers, those numbers sound extreme, but it's actually quite common for beekeepers to lose 2, 4, 10, or 100% of their colonies die in the winter,
Yep.
which is very expensive. It is a minor disaster every time it happens. We were thankfully able to go get 3 gallons of honey from our hive. So we took the honey shortly after one died, then the other one was about to die, and we went and raided their honey supply. So we got some honey. My folks did not get a single drop of honey. 4 hives, no honey. The amount of money and resources and months taking care of these animals is just extreme. What does it look like? Apparently, this is now the beekeeping episode, folks. You're welcome. What does it look like, Robert? Of course, the winters up there are harsh. Do you always kill all your hives and grab all the honey? Do you ship them somewhere else? Do you keep them inside or what?
We typically let ours die out. We harvest in early August, and then we cap we cage the queen at that point and just let them die out. And then by October or so, when it's getting too cold, we just have a handful of bees left, and then we typically dispatch them.
Okay, so you're ordering new queens every year, and that's actually just normal for you. Is that right?
That is because of such a
Okay.
long winter and a short summer.
Yeah, I've never been to Alaska, but I've heard the summers up there are a level of extreme that is just beyond. Uh, I, I've heard so many different stories of people who have been up there and lived up there. What is the craziest thing you've ever seen while you're out running your dogs?
Oh my goodness, I could probably tell you stories for days, but I think the coolest experience I ever had, Brian, was I was out on a 150-mile race called the Goose Bay 150. It
Whoa.
was an Iditarod qualifier several years ago, and you go out 75 miles and then you camp. And typically, a camp is not camp like we think about it. The dogs are asleep and you're doing all the work. So think about that in terms of business,
Uh-huh.
literally burning the midnight oil. But anyway, I arrived, I don't know, maybe 10 or 11 o'clock at night, and all the other mushers had done their chores and they were in the warming cabin. They were, doing their part inside because they've already done their chores outside. And I was the only one out there. So I settled down into sort of my typical sleeping pattern where I'm leaning up against a sled and I throw the parka over my head and kind of get a few hours sleep. And in the middle of the night, I could feel it getting a little bit colder. I lifted the parka over my head and I looked up above, and some of the most spectacular northern lights I've ever seen.
No
And
way.
there I am, sort of out there in the middle of nowhere. My dog team's there with me. I'm there, and it's just this surreal experience. It literally is like a National Geographic photo or something like that. It was such a cool experience.
You started telling the story, and I thought about asking a bit later a follow-up question. Have you ever seen the Northern Lights from your sled?
Of
And
course, yes.
and then now, well, I've only barely seen them a little bit in Iceland once, little tiny, a hint, and then we see these pictures. And what does it even do to your brain to be in an area so beautiful? But then again, you have to be uncomfortable, right? That all the other mushers were all inside being warm and not being frigid, and you, foolhardy, were being outside in the weather. But then you got to see this gift that they all couldn't see because their eyes were screwed up from artificial light or they were sleeping or whatever. What does it do to your soul to be out there and see the northern lights like that?
Well, first off, I did not mention, Brian, that I was in last place. That was why I was outside. Everybody else had been there for hours, so I
Uh-huh.
was way late. But
Uh-huh.
anyway, it is a magical experience. When people see the Northern Lights on television or in the movies, they think it's this something that they can plan, and it isn't. They pop up and they're only here for just a few minutes, and it's this little
Really?
nugget of nature that if you're lucky to see, it is such a cool thing because it literally is a nature's light show. It's spectacular. And if you're out there doing something you love, like on a dog team, or you're out hunting or camping or whatever, that's what people come to Alaska for. That's what people pay thousands of dollars for, to come up here and to see that. And if you get that gem, it's just such a cool experience.
Man, now I want to go up and just run some dog sleds.
Come
No,
on up.
I imagine the level of difficulty here is a bit intense, both because there's the weather, there's also the working with dogs. 'Cause how many dogs do you have on a team usually?
Well, we have, like I said at the beginning, we have 36 sled dogs. We typically break those into teams of 8, 10, or 12, depending on the
Okay.
distance where we're going. And then we're out there. Of course, most of our time in the winter is spent training the dogs. And I know we want to talk about some teamwork here in a few minutes, and we could definitely dive into that. But training is not training like you would think of with your dog. It's not out there teaching sit, stay, down, come, all that. We're teaching the team to work together, to learn from each other, to learn the trails, to learn the commands, to learn to kind of fire on all cylinders. That's what training is all about. And when we hook up and we could go for a 40-mile run, and that could take 8 or 10 hours, depending on how many dogs and the trail conditions and all that. So we're out there for quite a while.
You just brought me back to 5 years ago. I was on my second ascent of Mount Rainier, and I was leading a rope team this time. So I was a middle level. There's the climbers who are just on a rope. There's the rope leads who are responsible for their lives, and there's the climb leader who's responsible for all the ropes. This climb is two ropes. I was one of the rope leads. The other rope lead was the climb leader, and we go up there on day one up to Camp Muir, and it's like a 5 mile walk, but you're doing a mile vertical. So it's it's a pretty exciting day, and then you rest the second day, and then the second night is after a few hours of sleep, quote unquote, is when you depart. So we leave at 11 p.m. or so at night. But that day, that second day, is snow school, where in this climbing club we got to make sure everyone is on point with all their skills, because they might have to pull one of us, including myself, out of a crevasse if we fall, or save our lives and keep us from dying. So that's what we spend our time on. So we get the climb leader's just back hanging out in his tent enjoying himself, and I'm up there as the junior instructor running snow school and taking everyone through the drills just to make sure everyone knows exactly the same thing. And okay, when we do this, we're going to do it that way. We're doing things this way to get us all on the same page. And the result is when we all work together, we were able to go make a successful ascent. Everyone got up there. No one died. Everything's fine. Had just a beautiful day on the mountain. And that was a beautiful second ascent for me, as now this next level of responsibility is both training both rope teams and then also leading my rope team going up. But there's this interesting thing that I think most of us don't get a taste of. When you are leading a rope team of three other people, you're suddenly you change from four individual humans into one different thing. And this different organism, you're paying attention to what's the weather doing to each person, what is each person eating, when did they last pee, how are they feeling, can they feel their hands, are they stumbling, what's their mood. Everything becomes literally life and death, because you're on Mount Rainier. Mount Rainier kills a few people a year. And I'm really curious, you with your 8 or your 10 or your 12 dogs, what is it like when you stop being Robert Forto, individual human, and you start being Robert Forto, who is connected to this thing that is the sled? I'm imagining something similar to what I experienced on the mountain on the rope. Is that right?
Very similar. As you were telling that, it sounded very similar to what we do here. We are looking for that cohesion. We're looking for that process to work correctly. And like you said, if one thing misfires, the whole team can just become into shambles. Of course, often in our case, it's not life or death as it is on Rainier, but you have to make sure you know every individual in the team. You know their quirks, you know their strengths, you know their weaknesses, you know when they need to rest, when they can, pull further or faster or whatever. And as the musher, you're literally the quarterback of the team. You're giving the plays, you're giving the commands, and the team is doing the work. So if you think about sort of Tom Brady as the dog musher, and he's firing off the plays in the huddle, and it's required that everybody else has their own job. In a dog team, the dogs closest to you are the wheel dogs. They're typically like the offensive linemen on a football team. And then you have your playmakers. Those are the swing dogs, or the point dogs. Those are the dogs closer to the lead dogs. They're the ones that are catching the passes, if you will,
Hmm.
in a football team. And then you have the lead dogs, which are, they are the playmakers. They are the Cooper Cups. They are the Stefan Diggs. Those types of guys on your team, and they're the ones that are making sure it happens. Because as a dog musher, Brian, you're not talking to the whole team. You're talking to the lead dogs. You're giving those guys commands, left, right, G, haul, whoa, stop, take a break, let's go, etc. And then what's happening is as those dogs are performing at their best, all the other dogs are sort of playing in tandem. So they're listening
Hmm.
to each other. Not only are they listening to the lead dogs, but they're listening to the dogs right next to them. Is this dog pulling too hard, too fast? Is he leaning on me? Do I need to bump him off? So it becomes this sort of organism, as you talked about on Rainier, where everything's sort of just rocking and rolling. And it's truly a magical experience when you're out there, because when you can just get out there in the middle of nowhere and be out there at 40 below or in the middle of a snowstorm or whatever, and you just lean back, you take the headphones out of your ears, and you hear nothing except the swish, swish, swish of the dog's feet hitting the trail. It is such a cool experience. And you see that whole team process coming to play where everything's just working.
What is the coldest temperatures you've ever mushed in?
Well, I know for a fact it's minus 36. When
Holy
we left the
smokes.
truck, we went out to Yetna Station, which is down on the Sioux River, and it's typically about 20 degrees colder there. When we got there, I remember going into the roadhouse and asking the proprietors there, "How cold is it?" And they said, "Well, our thermometer bottoms out at 40 below, so it had to have been below 40." But it's dang cold. I know you were talking about before we went on about your uncle or somebody that lived up here
Yeah.
working in those temperatures. It is a really cold day. But as we say in the dog mushing world, it's never too cold. You just have the wrong gear.
Yeah. You're making my mountaineering stories sound tame. I was saying, yeah, I've been on Mount Rainier once alone in the winter, which is the best time, by the way. Though not if you're inexperienced, because then you'll die. But if you're not inexperienced, winter alone is beautiful. There's no one around. No one will hear you scream. There's no help anywhere. And I was walking along and I heard the snow squeak at me as I'm snowshoeing up the mountain. And I thought, I've never heard snow squeak at me before. And I ended up, before I was even out of sight of the parking lot, all my water had frozen. And I was just heading up north as the sun was setting. This was around the solstice some years back, the winter solstice. And I ended up sleeping in my truck. Uh, and when a ranger saw me in the morning that I was still alive, which he was quite thankful for, he said, yeah, I was 11 degrees down at Paradise, was probably around 6 degrees, or 11 at a Longmire where the ranger station is. So probably 6 degrees at Paradise where I was, which is around 5,500 feet. And to me, that 6 degrees was the coldest I've ever been in my life. And I'm trying to even comprehend 50 degrees colder than that. Because that was already cold enough that exposed skin, if you took your gloves off within a few seconds, your hands would start to go numb.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
you're talking about negative 40. What is that like to actually maneuver?
It's dang cold, and here in Willow, we're sort of in this cold belt of South Central Alaska. It gets much colder here than it does in
Huh.
areas that surround us. We routinely have in, say, I don't know, Christmas or so to about the beginning of February, we will have a month or so of negative 20, 25, 30 every day, all day. And it's a chore just to do your chores, not only the dog chores, but you have to get up every day and go outside and start your truck and make sure that the pipes aren't frozen and you keep the wood stove going. And even though we have all the modern conveniences that you can possibly have, fast internet and all of that stuff, we still have to make sure that we keep the fort rolling, as they say, because if you don't, if you slip, it's a bad day.
Thank you for these amazing stories, Robert. Tell us about your podcast. Tell us about your book.
Well, we have a children's book. It's called A Musher's Dream, Team Aneke. It's the story of how we moved up to Alaska. It's about for, I don't know, second or third graders. You can buy it on our website at dogworksradio.com. That is also our podcast. We do a weekly podcast where we talk about dog training. That's our bread and butter. That's where we make our money. You can find us there at alaskadogworks.com. And our podcast airs a couple of times a week. And what we do cool in the winter, of course, during Iditarod time, we do a daily podcast show, and that's listened by people all over the world. And I think we're the only daily podcast that's also on terrestrial radio anywhere in the world that talks about dog mushing. So I like to hang my hat on that a little bit.
That's amazing. Robert, Folks can also find you on Twitter, Robert Forto. That's Forto. Robert, thank you so much for being on Redbeard Radio.
Thank you very much, Brian.